You're listening to episode 242 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Matthew O'Connell and Stuart Baldwin join us to speak about post-traditional Buddhism and Imperfect Buddha podcast. In Buddhism, we have, broadly speaking, the big three: Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. It's much more complicated than that, but those tend to be the primary branches of traditional Buddhism. Of course, once upon a time there was only Dhamma, and over time, evolutionary principles had their effects. A population exposed to selective pressures over time leads to change, or dying out. Buddhism's encounter with modernity seems to be undergoing punctuated equilibrium, or rapid evolution, as we have the new forms of secular Buddhism, pragmatic Buddhism, natural Buddhism, and the branch of today's conversation, post-traditional Buddhism. Matthew O'Connell runs a life coaching business in Northeast Italy and also teaches English as a foreign language, which includes hosting a weekly radio program called The English Hour. When asked, he teaches meditation within a coaching dynamic. Matthew has been doggedly involved with Buddhism for over 20 years. Originally involved with Tibetan Buddhism, he experimented with Theravada and Zen before finally freeing himself up to follow a post-traditional approach, which has been supported by the mentoring of Hokai Sobol. Matthew's writings and experimental work on Buddhism can be found at the Post-Traditional Buddhism site, including deconstructions and reconstructions of the Four Noble Truths, the Four Paths to Enlightenment, and more. His latest project is called the Imperfect Buddha podcast, and it aims to tackle the limits of Buddhism in the West and the taboos surrounding it, whilst pushing for its radical transformation into a genuine means for individual and collective liberation. It features explorational conversations and banter from the co-hosts and interviews with the fringe element of Western Buddhism. Stuart Baldwin started meditation training and internal work at age 18. He worked in the technical sector for a number of years, culminating in working for Cisco Systems in London, and directly followed by running the IT, audio, and video department at Shambhala's European Retreat Center in rural France. Currently and specifically focused on playfully exploring established boundaries and applying technical skills on the Imperfect Buddha podcast, training in hypnosis, hypnotherapy, and martial arts, as well as challenging his assumed beliefs and opinions about reality. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice rubbish beer. It'll make sense when you listen to the episode. Our guests today are Matthew O'Connell. Matthew, thanks for being here.
You're welcome. It's good to be here.
And Stuart Baldwin. Stuart, glad to have you.
Hi, Ted. Good to be on the show. Thank you.
So we have a lot of rich topics to get into today, and we're going to start by just asking you to tell us about your background. It sounds like the two of you have some history together in Buddhism.
Yeah, that's right. Shall I begin, Stuart?
Absolutely, go for it.
There you are. You're still with us. Okay. So, yeah, Stuart and I met, I think, when we were 16 or 17. We were working part-time in a warehouse, actually, while we were studying. And I don't actually remember the beginnings. Maybe Stuart will be able to say something about that later. But I know that at some point we hooked up, and it was primarily due to sharing similar interests in spirituality in general and then Buddhism. Does that sound about right, Stuart? Can you remember something?
Yeah, that does. We were working in a warehouse, good physical work, and yeah, that the relationship did kick off there. I remember.
Yeah, I can't remember. I think we might have actually got to know each other though through the use of recreational drugs, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, which is an important part actually probably of both our journey towards, Buddhism and before, during, and afterwards. Do you want to hear something about my history with Buddhism, Ted? Well, it's worth saying. I'll add a couple of points, but I'll try and keep it short because the long version is pretty long. But my parents, I think, like for most people, were quite influential. My mother was a New Age hippie. I was born in '76, so I grew up with her, actually. My father was an atheist and an intellectual and a Marxist, so that was quite a sort of a contrast. They didn't stay together for very long, which is probably quite obvious. But yeah, I remember my mum actually taking me to meditation classes when I was about 8 or 9. She was a member of an odd group that listeners may or may not be familiar with called the White Eagle Lodge, which was an odd combination of spiritualism, sort of channeling of some sort of spirit, meditation, distance healing, and Christian ethics. It was all very odd. She took me along to that, and then I think in my mid-teens, I also started reading a few books on Buddhism. There are 3 books, and the first one, I'd be very curious to know if any of the listeners recognize it. It was a book by a fake Tibetan Lama called Lobsang Rampa. Have you heard of him, Ted?
The name's not ringing any bells.
Yeah, he actually wrote a version of the life of Milarepa, which he completely made up. And at the same time, yeah, and what you may not know is actually it's one of the best-selling Buddhist books of all time.
Critical thinking skills are just such an imperative part of any spiritual practice.
Yeah, you can imagine as well what a book like that might have, the impact it might have on an impressionable mind at 14. So, there he was talking about this magical figure of Milarepa with these mystical powers, and I was quite intrigued, I must say. But that was followed up, fortunately, by another book called The Way of Non-Attachment by a guy called Dhiravamsa. I think he might actually still be alive. He was a Thai Buddhist monk. That was a great book. That was actually where I initially learned Vipassana meditation. So that was 14 or 15. And then I read another book which scared the hell out of me and actually forced me to sort of set aside Buddhism for a while, called Buddha Mind by a chap called Toku Tondup, who, again, I think might still be alive. When I read that, I was going through a very difficult patch at school, and he started talking about, emptiness and the lack of the self, and it scared the hell out of me. I put it back on the shelf and forgot about Buddhism until I was about 19. At 19, I had a very bad experience, actually, with the recreational drugs, especially things like magic mushrooms, which are the psychedelics. Psilocybin, yeah. So after playing around with those for years, I ended up going towards Buddhism again. I found a Tibetan Buddhist center in Bath, which is near Bristol, where I grew up. Unfortunately, mentioning the cult episode that we'll get onto at some point, the group I met there was called the New Kadampa Tradition, and I spent a couple of years with them. Do you know anything about the New Kadampa Tradition, Ted? Yeah, they're a sort of form of highly sort of fundamentalist sectarian Tibetan Orthodox Buddhism, and they're I think they're slightly worrisome. But if you want to know more about them, you can check out one of the episodes that we did on Buddhist cults. But they were I would say more innocuous back in the day. So when I met them, they were pretty harmless. And I remember them doing classes in the evening on books like Shantideva's The Way to the Bodhisattva Life and so forth. I ended up actually moving in with them for a year and a half, and I even contemplated becoming a monk at some point. Thank God I didn't do that. That would have not been a good road to go down. I don't think I would have lasted very long anyway. And actually, while I was living in one of their centers, they actually tried to set up a Buddhist college in southwest England in a region called Devon. And after a while, after contemplating and playing around with this idea, I think I kind of got back to myself in a sense and started rebelling. And they were about to throw me out at some point. And at that point, Stuart told me, this is where the link comes in, about a teacher he was working with called Caroline Sherwood. And she was a Vipassana teacher as well. And she did many other things. She was quite involved with the New Age world. And Stuart seemed to be getting some really positive results from his work with her. So I decided at more or less the same time to leave that center and start working with her. And that was great. And that's one of the ways Stuart and I reconnected. And I mean, I could say more, but maybe that's a good point, a good place for you to say something to Stuart about your relationship with Caroline.
Yeah, sure. I think it was before that. It was before you went off to the center, the NKT center. Because I remember I was still working at the warehouse when I started that working relationship with Caroline. I was studying a philosophy class, and I didn't find much. There wasn't much connection for me within the material that was being taught, and there wasn't much application to daily life. And Caroline came in as, to do Vipassana, to showcase meditation and to showcase what that was. And I was impressed by the way that she came across as a person, the way that she presented the material, and asked if she'd teach me. And she said yes, and that was a year-long training. So that's how I got in. I was around 18. I went on from there to look briefly at the Arrow tradition, which you probably know, Ted. David Chapman studies with the teachers of that, and his work's very interesting. That didn't work as a fit in terms of traditional systems. That's very on the edge of a traditional system, but it wasn't a good fit for me, and I was there for a very short amount of time. I also went to Nepal. I think leaving the warehouse, I went off to Nepal. I went to Nepal for about a month, and just had a look there and an explore, and that's really how I started to get into that stuff.
Excellent. Thanks for giving that base history for both of you. And it sounds like since those are your teen years, it's continued since then. So tell us about maybe the past few years between then and now. How has that progressed for both of you? And staying in touch as friends on the path.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think we lost touch for a while, didn't we, Stuart? Because for the audience that may not be aware, I live in Italy and I'm based in Italy, and I've been out here for about 13 years now. So Stuart and I connected when I came back to Bristol. Stuart came over to see me once or twice, but we lost touch for a while. And then every time I would come over to see him, we would often have these relatively drunken chats about Buddhism. And we would sort of, unload a lot of our sort of complaints or dissatisfactions. And we would also, try to set the world to rights, as you often do when you're quite young. So, and in fact, we'll come back to this later, but that was one of the sort of the ideas that got me thinking about collaborating with Stuart on the podcast, was the fact that even though we were a bit, tipsy and often quite passionate, our discussions were a lot of fun, really a lot of fun. And they were the sort of discussions that I think for both of us we found quite difficult to have with other people. Certainly for me, I live in a Catholic country, and almost none of my friends and acquaintances here are Buddhists. Buddhism has an extremely minor presence here. So if I'm exploring Buddhism, or if I'm discussing it or critiquing it or deconstructing practices and ideas, it's almost always online, or it's when I leave the country. So that's part of the history, or our history, which we'll probably get onto in a little bit. But for me, when I left that center and I started working with Caroline again, I worked with her for about 6 months, and again, she was great, very, very good. Appreciated that time with her. But at the same time, I got married actually, and my wife at the time was very, very interested in shamanism and neo-shamanism. And she didn't have a car, and I remember I had to take her along to go to a meeting that was taking place, and I sat in just because, it was better than sitting in the car. And I kind of got into it at the same time, and I spent about 15 years actually intensely being involved with this neo-shamanic group, which was fantastic. It was, quite transformative, and I would say actually it resonated in many of its practices and ideas with various aspects of Tantric Buddhism, especially Tibetan Tantric Buddhism. And at the same time, while doing that, I continued exploring different Tibetan Buddhist groups in the UK. And then finally, when I came over to Italy, also here. But I always continue with a daily sitting practice of Vipassana, which later evolved into, let's say, non-dual style sitting practices such as Mahayana, the Mahayana practices and the Vajrayana practices, in particular, Dzogchen and what am I thinking of? Mahamudra, that's the word that was escaping me. And I don't know, I was always disappointed, Ted. I know this is something you want to chat. I always found the group dynamics of all the Tibetan groups that I went to, and even the non-Tibetan groups that I experimented with as well, in looking for an alternative, to be deeply dissatisfying. They were primarily filled with middle-aged, let's say middle-class women from England. And, I don't have anything against them, of course. But I was always the youngest person there, and almost always the only male. And I think there was a huge generational gap. And I think we were looking for very different things. I was always very intense as a teenager, and I guess I still am. And I was looking for something that was a bit more revolutionary, a bit more biting almost. I hadn't forgotten that crazy book about Milarepa that I'd read, and I wanted to find out, what's enlightenment? Is it real? Can we get some radical change going on or not? And oddly enough, at the same time, I was getting that from the shamanic group to a certain degree, and I wasn't getting it from Buddhism. But I felt a very, very strong connection, and I needed something more. Actually, when I came over to Italy, I found quite a good group in Venice, because I live about 2 hours from Venice. And that was a Kagyu school center. And they had a visiting English teacher called Clive, and I forget his surname. They were connected to Samye Ling, which I think is one of the oldest non-Tibetan monasteries in the world. I think it might be the first one in Europe.
I think it's the first one. It's up in Scotland. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. And I think it's the one where Chogyam Trungpa originally came over as well. He spent time there as a teacher. Anyway, I found that they were doing some very, very interesting work in trying to almost bring secular ideas and values into the way they were teaching Buddhist meditation, even though it was a Tibetan Kagyu school. And I liked the way they were doing things. But I was still quite dissatisfied with the dynamics of the group, which I felt was still sort of caught up with the sort of cult personality of Tibetan Buddhism, and, the sort of what I would call the excessive admiration for the symbology and metaphors of Tibetan Buddhism. And at that point, I kind of had enough, I needed something a bit more intellectually stimulating. And that happened to be at the same time that the Buddhist Geeks got going, the Buddhist Geeks podcast, and I followed them, really from their inception. And I found a lot of what they had to say interesting. I dabbled with the Dharma Overground with Daniel Ingram, and participated in the forum there. And I experimented with the noting practices as well for about 1.5 years, 2 years. But for me, I think we mentioned this in our last podcast episode. Stuart and I share this. I was always more attracted or drawn towards the Tibetan style of practice, and I wanted that. And to bring it full circle and come to the end, I decided, once I heard Hokai Sabul on one of his episodes, and I heard he was Croatian, I thought, well, okay, this guy seems interesting. He's bright. And where I live in Trieste, it's 45 minutes from Croatia, from the Croatian border, and it's an hour actually from where Hokai lives. So I wrote him an email, and I asked him. I told him about my background. I said, could you teach me? Could you help me out with my meditation practice? Because I haven't got anybody at the moment. And he agreed to that, and I've been sort of working with him on and off for the last 3 or 4 years. So that's pretty much my background.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. And having met Hokai Sobol, he was part of a colloquium that I was participating in. He struck me as a pretty good teacher, very insightful. So I'm glad that you made that connection, and hope that goes well for you.
Yeah. Well, it's gone well so far. It's 3 or 4 years. It's quite long, I guess. Excellent.
Stuart, how about you? Fill in that gap between the younger years and today.
Sure, absolutely, Ted. I'd love to. So, that's where to start is a good question. My practice is not as extensive as Matthew. I think Matthew's gone quite across the board and gone into a lot of interesting places with his approach. And it was, let's see. So I went into the technical field. I started to go into, I really wanted to develop useful life skills and people skills and work, in a collaborative sense with people within that arena. And so I put myself through university and did a computer networking degree. And long story short, ended up working my way through that, through a number of corporations, and then working for Cisco Systems in London. Loved it, really interesting field, but it had something lacking. Like there wasn't enough depth. There wasn't enough personal depth within that field, and I started finding that the harder I worked at that, the less satisfied I was with it. As interesting as it was, as stimulating and challenging at a certain intellectual level that it was, and the excellence of the people, the certain excellence that arena attracts, I started to find it very, very lacking and very empty. So I had 5 years of Aikido training. So I was in London, and one of the reasons I wanted to go to London was to train a dojo that was set up by Chiba Sensei, who was one of Morihei Ueshiba's or Sensei's, the guy that set up Aikido, one of the main dojos that was set up in the UK. So I went to train there, and he was very focused on Zen style practice, and I didn't get involved with the end of session sits that he would do. But I was very, very impressed with his style. It was incredibly fluid, Aikido style, and very developed. He was a very good guy called Devinder Bhatt Sensei. He's a good Aikido master. And I thought I should get back into my sitting practice. I really should, time's ticking away. I've done what I wanted to do. I focused on that. And to a certain degree, that was necessary because I needed to focus 100% on getting those skills, but once they were developed, it's time to get back to practice. So I went along to Shambhala, who I'd always wanted to do the warrior training with them, and got into the Shambhala warrior training in Clapham Junction, I believe they're at, and did the training with them. Now, interestingly, when I got back into the practice, my career fell to pieces. The ground just disappeared from underneath me. I'm like, oh, fantastic. All of that work for what? So I went through some mentoring and really to figure out where I was at with outside of that system. I don't want to go into too finer specifics with that, but that was extremely useful. And one of the results was that I was going to go and volunteer for Dechen Choling over in France, which is near Limoges, so it's fairly central France. And I did that for 3 months or so, and I was just, basically doing grunt work, digging holes, shifting stuff, helping them set up tents, drilling things, hammering stuff, good solid work, a really good change from doing desk work for all that time.
Sounds like slave labor, Stuart.
It was. I had to pay.
You had to pay to work.
They
wow.
made me pay €5, €10 a day to do that.
Okay.
So that finished. I finished that. I came back to the UK, but there was a position open for audio, video, and head of audio, video, and IT over there. And so I took that on for a year. I took that on as a year's contract. So I ran their IT department for about 20 people. Did the audio setups for 200, 300 people events, and, managed the video to make sure that the video went through the proper channels and all of that stuff. So I came away with some good skills, but not so happy with the organization, not so happy with their style and approach, and really had a problem with the group dynamic. Very inspired with the teachings, but just found the material and the content, sadly lacking. So on my return, Matthew was mentioned a podcast. Maybe we should do a podcast. Wouldn't it be good if there was time, if it was possible to do a podcast? And I wrote back and I said, hey, we could do this. I've got the technical skills. I'm happy to start the groundwork and start looking into the technical aspects and how we could do that. And that's really how the podcast started to develop from there.
Awesome. Thanks for telling us about the background with that. And I thought
Yeah.
what I'm hearing from both of you, and maybe this is a good chance for us to open up this area of the conversation, is you each mentioned some things that you were running into that were a bit problematic for you, either the group dynamics or some other things that were happening. I'm wondering if we might talk about that a little bit, what you each were finding problematic in those situations. Was it the practice, the group? What was that about? Maybe, Matthew, we can start with you.
Okay. Well, I think the story is quite long again, but I should try and be clear that I think the problems were always there, and I think the problem actually comes from an experience I had when I was quite young, which I'll mention because it will give sense to a lot of why we're doing the work we're doing, and why, for example, I write the stuff that I write over post-traditional Buddhism. When I was 14, I actually got into trouble with the police, and I'm giving you a bit too much information here, probably. I'm no longer a criminal. But anyway, I was hanging around with the wrong guys, and I got into trouble twice. And the second time, basically, the police said to me, "Look, we won't send you off to what you would call, I guess, juvenile hall, but you've got to make some changes. And one of them is you can no longer hang around with the people you've been hanging around with." And this was in secondary school, which for you is high school, of course. And at that time, I really was forced to leave them behind. And I don't know what it was like in America and whether this is still the case for teenagers, but teenage boys in the 80s, early 90s were like pack animals. I mean, they really were quite feral sometimes. And when I left them, right, yeah, very often, they turned on me. And it was weird because they basically put me in a situation where I was ostracized and I had to find a new group of friends. And I remember spending the last year and a half of secondary school, which finishes at 16 in the UK, trying out all of the different Buddhist groups. And I had this very odd experience. I don't really know why I got it, but I did, was that I had this perception that all of the different groups were basically trying to make a self. They were trying to produce a mask that would allow them to fit into very specific social circles and then be accepted. That's right. It was an attempt to formulate a sort of codified, agreed upon identity. And I had to pass through all of the different social groups, and none of them seemed to have a mask that I could put on. I tried. They were all extremely uncomfortable. And so I kind of left secondary school with this hole, this sense of, who am I? What's life? And so forth, which of course many people have had, but it was amplified by being rejected almost by the original group that I belonged to. And I think I had a very similar experience when I went to Buddhist groups, Ted. That is, they seem to be doing exactly the same thing. And I noticed that very early on. At the beginning, it was lovely, of course, especially with the Tibetan Buddhist groups, because they've got a structure which is very welcoming. It's got, a father figure in the form of the guru. It's got beautiful colors and shapes and forms. And, when I arrived there when I was 19 after I had that bad experience, I mean, they accepted me fully, and I felt like I belonged. But at the same time, after a few months of being around them, I was like, there's something not quite right here. They're all a bit fake, and it might sound a bit nasty to say. And of course, it's a generalization, and of course, many of them were good people, but I started to notice that they were using the same language. So, a person would come into the group, and after maybe a month, they'd be highly dedicated, and they'd be reproducing the same phrases and terminology as everybody else in the group. They would start to be smiling a lot. They'd all start to behave in very specific, agreed upon ways. And I realized that wasn't for me, and I probably wasn't in the right place. And what I tended to find with all of the groups that I've been to is that happens. And it's something that I can't stand. It's something I've never been able to tolerate since. And although let's say that some of the groups I spent time with in the later years in my relationship with Buddhism, they were better, they would still fall back into the same routine of, sort of forming this collective identity. So for me, I would say that's the sort of the core complaint I have about Buddhist, let's say, traditional Buddhism or organized Buddhism. And I think it's probably quite difficult actually to avoid that happening completely. But I think it probably is possible to make that process more transparent. And I would say that one of the failings of also many contemporary forms of Western Buddhism is that they don't yet do that. Or if they do, it only goes so far. And I think because it only goes so far, much of what goes on in Buddhist groups is an attempt to almost pacify some of the uncomfortable edges and some of the uncomfortable aspects of group dynamics that really, I think, should be made more explicit. Because my view of Buddhism, in its, let's say, its best aspect, is it can be a means for liberating individuals and groups. And for me, that's what I'm most interested in. I'm actually not particularly interested in Buddhism as Buddhism. I'm interested in how it could or can or potentially could produce a theory and practice of liberation that actually works on human beings rather than Buddhists, and doesn't require, let's say, the Buddhist mythology in order to make it accessible to a wider audience. And that's what I'm after, and I don't see a lot of that happening.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you've said, and one of the biggest challenges that we find in pushing back against the cult of personality or the cult of a very hard-edged ideological stance, it's this way and no other, is, so what's the alternative? How might that look? So every now and then I'll get an email from someone saying, I want to join, I want to be a secular Buddhist, and there's this very heavy-laden identity need, an interest in how do I be this thing? And of course, one of the things that we're trying to do is explore not having it be that requirement of here are the following things that you need to be in order to, get the card and be able to identify in this way, because it's not about the ism, it's not about the identity. Quite the opposite. To me, it's sometimes about dismantling that attachment to identity and exploring what does this mean to you in changing your life, transforming it in ways that are beneficial to you. But it's always a little tricky of, okay, so then what is this? And we sometimes, the SBA, we get questions about, well, what are you? And we only have these very broad arcs because it's been that uncomfortable unknowing of, if we get too specific, we've painted ourselves into the same corner that we're struggling with in some of the traditions and some of the groups we have out there of, here's exactly what one must think, and there's no creative flexibility in the moment with that. So it's a very, very interesting time to be in of, okay, so what do we do instead? What does that look like? That's an area I'm most interested in, too.
Yeah, and that's the question. In fact, my question for you would be, how successful are you at that, what you just described? I mean, are you having success with it? Are you able to attract people to taking this secular approach whilst not providing an alternative identity?
I think that's a great question. I would wonder first, how do we measure success at this? Because clearly it's not going to be in how many members, quotey fingers here, for those who can't see, I'm making quotey fingers. How many members do we have? It's not that. Is it numbers of people who visit the site or engage in programs? Possibly. I guess I'm more so interested in hearing from others who have engaged, has this been beneficial to you? And we make a point of not being very intrusive. We don't survey people. We don't poll them and ask these questions. So one of the problems we have is, how do we measure what the impact is? Has this been beneficial? We can look at, I think, very surface things like, well, yeah, downloads of the podcast keep going up. The membership on, people who want to join on the site to have discussions keeps going up. Facebook numbers, things like that. But those are very shallow. They're not really getting at the heart of, has this affected meaningful change in people's lives? And I don't know how to measure that. That's one of the things we're trying to figure out and learn about.
Yeah. Well, I think the key word there you've just said is meaningful as well. I think, as you well know, I think as most listeners will be aware of, much of what Buddhism, of course, has provided at the institutional level in the West is a new form of belonging, right? A new type of spiritual belonging. And I think, I'm not, although I'm quite strong in my opinions about much of Buddhism, I don't actually assume that I'm right or that my opinions are the best or that anybody should actually think like I do. And I've got no problem with people having those types of relationships with Buddhism at all. It's really not my place to, to destroy Buddhism or to get the next best thing or something like that. But I think the question becomes then, how do you create a meaningful form of belonging or participation, perhaps, in whatever it is you were doing? So for you, it's going to be the Secular Buddhism Association. And yeah, I guess as you said, it's difficult to get clear feedback on that. But I don't know. I think there are fundamental human needs, and belonging to something seems to be one of them. And I wonder, I mean, the thing I said before is the need for transparency about the fact that these are almost inevitable consequences of, trying to set up an institution of any type. You have to come to terms with those questions. And I wonder, I think sometimes people in the attempt to get away from the failings of whatever went before can end up sort of reproducing a new form of entrapment or a new form of ignorance or a new set of dysfunctional, let's say, institutional practices. So I wonder sometimes if it's simply not enough just to be transparent about it and talk about it openly and then, make a decision together about how you choose to belong together or participate together meaningfully. So
yeah, I completely agree with that, and that's the big challenge that we have faced in being an organization that's not an institution. It's a place to go and have the discussions, and okay. I in particular have resisted because of that that group need, that belonging piece.
Yeah.
That's not something I've never seen that go in a very positive direction. I've always seen that used for evil. Very rarely go in a consistent positive direction that affects meaningful, impactful change to the individual and to, of course, individuals make up groups to the group and then society at large. That's where I have a sticking point, and I hesitate to take a firm step forward in institutionalizing something, because all of those challenges that you mentioned, those pitfalls, then become very solid and very tangible and something that you do need to deal with. So for us right now, it's a dialogue in very tiny steps and sometimes glacially slow, which can be very frustrating. Sometimes it will feel like an avoidance of codification. Yes, honestly, there is some of that because we're still learning what this is because it's in so much transition. I did want to, Stuart, I want to give you a chance to go into this as well and talk about some of the things that you've run into as stumbling blocks, and one of the things that, maybe a couple of things that you have found problematic in your explorations of Buddhism.
Sure, absolutely, that'd be cool. It's interesting where to start, and I was listening to both of you talk that through and bounce ideas backwards and forwards, and it was really interesting to hear that. And I think my main problem with the way that contemporary Buddhism seems to work is that it's interesting to me because on one hand it's a closed system. The traditional system is a closed system. From my experience, and I'm sure there's definitely overlap with what you guys have both experienced and what listeners have experienced as well. And that's that it's the traditional system is a closed system, and it's not an open, and therefore by contrast, it's not an open system, right? So it's not an open source model. Now, my background, a big part of my background is technical work. And with technical stuff, you can't, like when setting up a computer network, it has to be tangible, it has to be solid. And if you're building it from the ground up, it has to be pragmatic. And so I was hoping when I stepped back out of that, I was doing internal work of various descriptions and descriptions. when I came back into it, I was kind of dismayed because the same problems that were there when I was a kid hadn't been worked out. You know, as a young adult, they hadn't been worked out, and we're talking a number of years later here, and I was quite disillusioned with that in a way, and also perplexed that the same, the same type of thinking was developing the same level of problems to a greater degree and more intracted. And that was a problem for me because when I work on something, I came back to Buddhism for the reason of wanting to dig deeper into it and explore and, challenge myself and grapple and, really work on that level and to deeper levels within myself and then apply that to my life and then relationship and the world, right? But because the tools were all hidden in different compartments, or as you said in the technology world, in different silos, so I couldn't, I'm not picking on them, but this is where my experience comes from. When working at Shambhala, I figured that because it's Chogyam Trungpa's system that it's going to be innovative, right? I didn't find that, and maybe some people do, and I still have friends that are within that system. So, but for me, it wasn't. And I found it very difficult to assess, like, if I'm going to take Samaya or Vajra commitment, which inspired me a great deal, I wouldn't have gone to work there if it didn't. I can't assess the system if I can't see past the next wall or the next wall or the wall after that. How am I supposed to make a lifetime commitment?
Right. It's not a RAID architecture. You don't have things going across silos.
That's right. And also, because of that, there isn't like what you're seeing with the internet or what the speculative non-Buddhist guys call the Great Feast. There isn't an intersecting of different ideas. So you're not getting evolutionary psychology and biology, coming to, throwing ideas around with philosophy or non-philosophy or other areas of knowledge, interpersonal communication and relationship stuff. There's a real mix there. And I think that everybody benefits from that if it's done in a good way. There's another side to that, though, being that if you have an open source system, you also need to have experts that are going to get involved with that and know what they're doing. And I think that's a challenge of, if we're talking about that is certainly a challenge that's on the table, Ted.
And that's probably the biggest challenge I think contemporary Western Buddhism has, actually, is quality teaching and access to teachers who can, in a sense, I would suggest, liberate Buddhism from itself. Because if I was going to be flippant, I'd probably say that the biggest stumbling block to Buddhism is Buddhism. And yeah,
we've heard that concept before, that there are things that need to be explored, introduced, put to the test, and some new things incorporated into what we're doing. And then we run into that question of, so once we do that, and that's a continuing dynamic process that doesn't stop, when is it no longer Buddhism? And I'll step up front and say, and is that a bad thing? I don't necessarily think so. But what is that edge?
No, that's not a bad thing.
No, it's not. It's not. But then that taps back into the point we were making before about identity, because what does Buddhism become then at that point? Does it become an empty vessel? Is it left aside for the creation of something new? And I think that's the amazing thing about knowledge and human activity, that, if you want to play with Buddhist concepts, the idea of emptiness and form, that things have to come into form, and if they solidify too much, as you were saying before, Ted, they become problematic. And I think again, thinking about some of the options that are available to people in this day and age, if you look at the Arrow Tear, who I also did some retreats with and spent some time with, I find it interesting the way they do things, and I find it interesting that David Chapman has stuck with them. And I think one of the things they do is they possibly do try to make explicit some of their inherent sort of contradictions, and they play with them. I think, though, I don't see the Arrow Tear being a serious, alternative to, mainstream Buddhism. And I don't know if Buddhism will survive this century in its current form. But I think I would suggest, Ted, that I think it really is possible for us to do more work on Buddhism and create something from it that could be powerful and it could impact others, and it may lose the name Buddhism. But I don't know if it's mindfulness. That would be my concern.
Agreed. Yep. Not
yeah,
necessarily. Not necessarily that leap.
No, and I think mindfulness is fine, and I think a lot of people have expectations of it, or stand against it for a variety of reasons. But as I mentioned before, I think what Buddhism could provide is a theory and practice of liberation. And as Stuart was saying, I think organized Buddhist groups in the West have to find some way, sooner or later, if they want to stay relevant, to engage with what is an immensely creative time of human knowledge that's emerging and being hugely available. And I think I think all Buddhists really could benefit from working on Buddhism and doing to Buddhism, rather than just allowing Buddhism to do something to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you put it very well. That's how does Buddhism stay relevant? And we can go back to just the core idea of, well, perhaps if we look at this as being about suffering and the extinguishing of it.
Yeah.
Great. What does that mean as a human being in our contemporary society that doesn't necessarily match up with what we have in a structure and a teaching and the stories, which are rich and wonderful, and I love them, but I'm not someone from 2,500 years ago. My perspective on the world is different. And the perspective of someone in the world 100 years from now is going to be different than mine. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That's where the interest and the fascination for the constant evolution comes from. We shouldn't shy away from that. That's something to embrace and embed ourselves in.
Yeah, well, for sure.
Absolutely. That's an interesting. That's cool. Thanks, Matt. That's an interesting point, Ted. And I think that unless it's an evolving system, unless it's a growing system, while staying true to itself and remaining open and challenging itself at the same time, that's going to change. That's going to be generational. So that's going to be, for example, and hopefully the last time I use it, but at Shambhala, they struggled to make the material that they had, which is a wide range of material, and it's rich, and it's culturally rich, and it's historically because of Tibet, but also because of Chogyam Trungpa, they have quite a fantastic level of material there. But they weren't holding on to the younger students. They just weren't staying there. And I don't think that that's specific to Shambhala. So I think that goes across the board. So, that's relevant for any center or tradition. And I don't think that that's even relevant to Buddhism. I think that that's a wider problem.
Yeah, I think you raised just a key point here, is that this is not a unique problem to Buddhism. It's not a unique problem to religions. It's something that exists in many different areas. So when I see folks who are critical of mindfulness, for example, and they'll point out particular problems that they see that are not unique to what's happening in mindfulness, in corporations or the military. It's the same in Buddhism. It's the same in other traditions as well. It's not unique to that. And I bring up that logical fallacy because it's so common. We'll see a problem and attribute it to the context in which it's found, and it's not necessarily unique to that particular context.
Yeah, and that brings us back to this wider thinking and looking further beyond the limits of Buddhism and, the tradition that you're part of, right? Yeah. I think as well, you said, Ted, before, I don't have the same problems as 2,500 years ago. I think, we don't have the same problems as 50 years ago to some degree, and I think the other challenge for Buddhism as well is going beyond itself in the sense of not just being a personal, introspective, individualized practice. And I think that's the other side of the coin when we talk about the challenges of institutions and organizations, because of course it's great to have freedom, it's great to have fluidity, and it's great to have a level of individuality in which people are not absorbing themselves into a collective identity. But at the same time, of course, the impact you have is lesser. And I think my question would be also, if Buddhism, if we do go for that core concept, which I'm quite happy to do, of looking at suffering, and if we do look in particular at perhaps, emotional and psychological suffering, which I think Buddhism can do something about, I think we have to be honest about the fact that Buddhism doesn't seem to be offering much in the way of a solution to the economic, political, and social problems that we see worldwide, To me, it's like, okay, if I'm a Buddhist and I've got this practice and it helps me to find greater space and freedom within myself, great. But what about, everyone else? Bloomin' egg. What about them? It's not enough.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's funny that much of the...
Sounds trite, but, we forget that sometimes, right?
No, it's very true. Some of the criticisms from the folks who will use the term McMindfulness will bring up that. They'll say, oh, but it's not changing the political landscape. And I'll say, and not get a response, neither does Buddhism. And is that a bad thing? Is that what it's intended to be? You can say, hey, this hammer really sucks at putting screws in wood. Well, you're right. Is that a bad thing, though? Is that what it's supposed to do? Is that what its core purpose is?
I think there's a facet of it that implies that it should be used that way. Whether it gets used that way or not is another matter, and then that becomes, is it a problem with the system, or is that a problem with people?
And it brings up the difference perhaps between the different traditions of Buddhism. Stuart and I obviously have more of a relationship with Tibetan Buddhism, and there is this noble idea of the Bodhisattva which hangs around and frees others from suffering. And I think maybe you're right, Ted, maybe it's an expectation that's gone too far, but the idea, or at least the sort of utopian idea of Tibetan Buddhism and the Bodhisattva is that if you free yourself, well, okay, what have you actually achieved? Freedom is actually, sticking around and helping to reduce suffering and ignorance in the world.
It's in relationship. It's not a unique thing just to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other idea that comes out from that is the idea that actually if you free yourself from, let's say, patterns of identification with the self and these patterns of psychological and emotional suffering, so what? That would be my response. So what? What meaning and relevance does that actually have to the world? And how do you deal with the fact that around you there is so much difficulty or so many problems? And again, that's not necessarily to say, okay, well, Buddhism should be some magical cure that lifts the entire world's suffering. But I think it is helpful to remind ourselves sometimes that, spirituality, whether we think it is or not, is always a social practice. We always do it in a way that emerges or is enacted afterwards in relationship with other people. And I think at that point, it is interesting to explore the question of how could we create social practice also, and extend the individual practice to behaviors or norms or some type of space, perhaps, in which we could start to contemplate and consider these questions. Because I think the benefits, as you must well know, Ted, of long-term meditation practice are real. They are tangible. And I think they do create an objectivity or an ability to go beyond your individualism and look at the world more cleanly and rationally, and actually be more present in whatever it is you choose to do to help. And I think, again, going back to what we were saying before, one of my criticisms is this, that Buddhism often, although it has the potential to provide that, which I think is already a lot, it often doesn't, because it entraps people in a narrative in which their suffering and their help actually is fed back into the Buddhist group or the Buddhist tradition. And it's codified in very, very limited forms. And I think if you take something like the idea of the concept of liberation and, overcoming this identification with the selfing narrative, I think that does provide you with a unique form of freedom that many other areas of knowledge, including much of Western philosophy, cannot provide. It doesn't provide that pragmatic set of meditation techniques or mind training techniques. And not just that, hundreds, if not thousands of years of first-person accounts of what happens when you actually do it, what's difficult, what's easy, what are the problems, what are the pitfalls. And I think if we could somehow create an opportunity for more people to make more progress with meditation techniques beyond just mindfulness, beyond just managing difficult lives, and actually create a culture perhaps of liberation, that could be a very interesting meeting point with the history of Western thought and knowledge, which I think has tended to not be as pragmatic as it could be. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah, complete sense.
Sounds good to me.
We're on. You should make a group that we can identify with to do that.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's start right here. Well, that probably brings us nicely towards some of the work, that we've been doing with the podcast and the post-traditional Buddhism.
Well, let's talk about, I was thinking the same thing. It's a great segue. Let's talk a little bit about that. Tell us a little bit about post-traditional Buddhism. What is that? And how that might be the same or different from a Protestant Buddhism. Let's just unpack that a bit.
Okay. Well, if you listen to the last episode I did, Ted, I actually made a statement which may or may not be true. You can tell us. But my impression of secular Buddhism, especially when thinking about Stephen Batchelor, is that it's quite close to Protestant Buddhism, and that's there are positives and negatives there. I don't think the post-traditional Buddhism project, as I've been carrying it out, is really Protestant Buddhism, although it could be. I actually stole the idea from Hokai Sabo. He wrote an article quite a long time ago, and it was named Post-Traditional Buddhism, What's Next, or something similar. He didn't really take that idea forward, but I liked it so much that I decided to go with it. The idea of post-traditional Buddhism is kind of transparent in the sense in the name. It's exploring Buddhism without any reference to tradition or reliance on tradition or veneration for tradition. The idea is it's saying what happens if you leave behind tradition? What happens if you actually free yourself of some of the problems that we've been talking about so far in this chat? And what happens is you gain an immense amount of freedom if you explore this concept. You gain a certain creative ability to critically and creatively think about and work on some of the concepts and practices of Buddhism. And that's what's been taking place at that website. It's all, it's non-professional. I'm not a Buddhist teacher. I teach meditation as part of a coaching practice, but it's not Buddhist. So I don't have any tradition that I have to sort of honor or belong to or replicate. And what I've done is basically I've tried to take a number of different tools, including critical thinking and including the heuristic that Glenn Wallace made, which you've probably seen, I imagine, the first work he did. And I've been using those thinking tools to work on Buddhism and also combine that with phenomenology and other aspects of Western philosophy to try and make sense of what happens when you've been practicing for 20 odd years and actually, trying to achieve to some degree what Buddhism seems to be promising. So I've done work on a post-traditional look at enlightenment or liberation. I've done similar projects on the Four Noble Truths, which I guess is not so distant from Stephen Batchelor's own work, which I think he calls them the Four Tasks. Is that right? Yeah,
Four Tasks, or sometimes the Four Ennobling Truths, is just shifting the perspective of, instead of things that you need to believe in, they're ways to live life, things to do.
Yeah. I guess I've been looking at them as sort of ideational forms. I'd probably describe it that way, which sounds a bit fancy, but if I look at something like, if you take one of the major facets of this work. So I've studied linguistics and English language studies, and of course a part of that was to do with the philosophy of language. But one of the rules that I gave to myself with this project was to basically try and be as clear as possible in the wording and the language I use, and that has involved me sometimes going in circles. But the end result has been that I've generally got rid of all Pali or Sanskrit terminology and Tibetan wording. And then I've tried to deconstruct the popular Western terminology that we use, such as enlightenment and awakening. And I've tried to constantly ask myself, well, what are we actually talking about? What is it really? And how could I explain any of this to somebody who doesn't know anything about Buddhism?
And that's always been the challenge of just raising awareness of this other way of living your life, of being in the world, is when we really cling tightly to these terms that are going to be absolutely meaningless to someone who realistically is not going to become a Buddhist.
Yeah. And it's amazing how loaded those words become, right? I mean, when a person talks enthusiastically about nirvana or karma or rebirth, it's very powerful. It's very powerful. And I think often those words they almost hold a sort of symbolic power, and that often protects them from proper critique.
Right.
And
They are privileged from questioning and exploration.
that's right. That's right. And also, not only that, they become sort of lazy codifiers, where, oh, we know what we're talking about. If you say karma and I say it, we know, right? It's that thing and it's our thing. And I think what I've tried to do is stop that entirely, really, really critically evaluate the words and concepts that I'm using and try to find a much more simple and then direct way of describing those things free of Buddhism. And that's basically what post-traditional Buddhism has been. I've done that as well. I've taken that similar approach to looking at meditation practice and the whole concept of practice. I've taken that approach to the Eightfold Path as well. And I think, it's to a degree, it's a personal project. It's a form of exploration. And I think it's had varying degrees of success, and I mean personal success. But I think it's opened up the possibility of a degree of creative re-engagement with Buddhism that I found incredibly liberating. And I think that's the point where I would see eye to eye with the non-speculative Buddhism chaps in their more, let's say, constructive deconstruction. And what I've tried to do, like I said, is take some of their ideas and be proactive. So I think, if you look at somebody like Matthias Steingart, who was quite sort of aggressive in his critique, especially of Tibetan Buddhism, it seems to me that the result he got from doing a similar work to my own was, to get rid of Buddhism, to leave Buddhism behind. I think for me, that's not really an option. As I said before, I think Buddhism still holds a lot of value. And I think it would be, disingenuous to say that I'm not a Buddhist or that I'm not engaging with Buddhists. It's like, stealing something and running off and saying, oh, it's mine now. But my view is that if we are, let's say, if we're clear enough in ourselves, if we've managed to get ourselves to a point of fairly healthy, psychological and emotional balance, and I think if we have a certain degree of objectivity and a creative dispensation, what's the word? I can't say it. Thank you, dispensation. Then I think Buddhism provides an immense array of resources that can be worked on. But I think for Buddhism to be of value, I think we do have to work on it, which is something I've said twice now. And I don't know if I'm clear in that, but I think we have to think about it. We do have to deconstruct. We shouldn't take for granted the practices and ideas. Even the word practice, that's one that I think probably you guys and even Stuart and I still throw around sometimes as if it means something. My practice, your practice. But what the hell are we talking about really?
Right. Because it can be vastly different.
Yeah.
And even the presumption that my practice as a secular Buddhist is somehow fundamentally different than what the person sitting next to me in the Dharma hall is doing. Maybe not so. Maybe it is exactly the same, despite our ideas about what it is we're doing. And that's a rich area for to take a look, to question, to deconstruct. And one of the things that I appreciate about what you're doing, what you're describing, what you have on there, is that you're not stopping at deconstruction and then, doing this with your hands and saying, okay, we're done, and stopping it. You're then going to, okay, so we've got these pieces now, and these are good pieces. There's good stuff in there. We have experienced this for ourselves. How might it fit into a different form? How might we reconstruct these Lego blocks into something else that's helpful and meaningful to us and possibly to others? Because as you're saying, it's not just about our own personal journey, attainment, whatever we want to vaguely refer to that as. It's about how it presents in the world. If it's only internal, I don't see a great deal of value to it beyond that individual's sense of well-being or what have you. Really where the benefits come in is, how does this affect more change, greater change in society and the world, and it starts with the individual, but it builds from there.
Yeah, yeah, it does. And I think there's a certain poverty in only going one way, in only deconstructing. And I think it's disingenuous to assume that that's enough. And certainly that was my gripe with my engagement with the speculative Buddhism guys. And I think it takes bravery, and I think it takes courage to say, okay, I've taken everything apart. Where do I want to go next? I think it's quite easy just to stop.
Right. It's very hard to then construct, to build something that has not been done.
Yeah. Especially, and as you were saying before, if you're so aware of the pitfalls, if you're so aware of what can go wrong, it becomes quite a delicate process. And I think one of the reasons my project, post-traditional Buddhism, is not trying to, get followers or tell anybody what to do, is because it allows me that freedom to not have to build followers or build the next ism. But I think, thank you for reading my work and noting that. I think it is possible to create something of value that could help others. And that probably brings us nicely to the podcast.
It does. Before we go into that, I do want to ask Stuart what some of your impressions and some of the benefits you're seeing come out of this work on post-traditional Buddhism. What's your perspective on that?
I think it's valuable work. I'm not sure if I heard Matthew say that it's valuable. It is indeed valuable.
Thank you, Stuart.
Yeah, absolutely. No problems, mate. And it was interesting to watch that work develop. And especially when I was, when I was getting back into studying and engaging with studying. And again, the deconstruction, I think it's a really interesting paradox in some ways, is that Buddhist practice, when you engage with Buddhist practice, to varying degrees and levels, there's a level of deconstruction of the self. There's a level of deconstruction of beliefs, habits, energetic engagement with others and with the self, with yourself. And it's really just kind of examining yourself and letting it fall to pieces and seeing what's there underneath. And it strikes me as ironic that Buddhism doesn't allow that to happen to itself in a certain way. And so when I was beginning to struggle with looking at the systems I was engaged with after working in the technology sector, I started to read a lot of Matthew's work there, of the reconstructing. Was it Matthew, reconstructing enlightenment, reconfiguring enlightenment?
Yeah, reconfiguring enlightenment. That's right.
Yeah. So I did some reading on that on maybe one of the first edits, and found it really interesting. And that's been boiled down to essentialize it, I believe, since. And again, very interesting material, very relevant material. And I think that has value. I think that work needs to be done. And if people aren't engaging with, their practice, whatever that might mean, then there's going to be, I think there is a fundamental difference within practices, within traditional practices. If between traditions, comparing where a person might be, whether they're starting out, whether they're advanced or wherever. There is a difference there. There's a difference on the spectrum of where they happen to be. There's a spectrum on why they're engaging. But there's also a difference with not only with the style of practice, whether they're doing advanced Tibetan yoga or whether they're doing Zen meditation or Theravadan style practice. There's a difference in that respect, but there's also a difference with how are they engaging, how are they allowing it to inform their lives, how does it spill over into the other areas of their life. Are they integrating it with their thinking? Are they critically thinking around that material? And that doesn't have to fall within what Matthew's calling a post-traditional Buddhism that he stole from Hokai, but it doesn't have to be in that framework. But I think that it does have to be in a framework that if people are getting engaged with this or any kind of practice and then are suddenly stopping to think, then that's a problem. There was a good example. My Aikido teacher, he's no longer around. He's dead now. But when he was engaging with Aikido, he was, and there's definite parallels. He had problems with, and this kind of links into the Bruce Lee story with him coming up with Jeet Kune Do in a way, is that the traditional style and approach had a whole load of stuff within it that wasn't relevant. Like, it couldn't be used in a street fight. If you ended up in a bar brawl, some of the material in there just didn't work, like muscle memory and training on punching and that kind of stuff, which Bruce Lee did. And so my Aikido teacher really enjoyed taking the Aikido movements apart and looking at the component aspects, figuring out how they worked and then putting them back together, not being disrespectful to the original, but staying true to the original, but how does this actually work? And that to me is interesting. That to me is very relevant within that sphere of work.
Yeah, to me the metaphor of evolution comes up again, that as we see things deconstructed and reconstructed and reevaluated, and as they take new forms and they find rich new territory to grow and to help people, it's not a disparaging of traditional forms. It's not that at all, nor is it a watering down of those. And a phrase I used in a different podcast recently was, my dog is not in any way disrespectful or condemning of wolves. He's just a different form. It's something else entirely. Wolves still exist on their own. The tradition will still exist on its own. And it's just simply the nature of evolution, and intentional evolution, because this was, of course, not natural selection. This is artificial selection to create something else that serves a different purpose, that fits a different place. And I think we're seeing something similar here, where we can take pieces and put them together in a different way and see what happens.
It's I agree, and it was mentioned in the last podcast that it's a human system. Buddhism is a human system, and so if it's going to be relevant, it needs to evolve, it needs to grow, and how do we participate in that?
Right. So I think, Matthew, now let's segue into the podcast and tell a little bit of the story of what made you start it. How did that come up?
Well, I think I hinted earlier at the fact that Stuart and I have a long, sort of broken up tradition of having very rich conversations about Buddhism, usually under the influence of alcohol. But not only. We are English, Ted. We're known for this. Usually it takes we actually start saying anything meaningful.
Americans never drink, so I don't know what that's like.
Of course not. The guys are purists. And if you do drink, you drink rubbish beer usually, so no problems.
Usually, yes.
So, I would suggest that both Stuart and I have rather unusual senses of humor at times. And we quite enjoy playing with ideas and playing with allegiances. And we've always done that with our own relationship with Buddhism. And in our long conversations, we would often work on Buddhism, actually, and playfully, sometimes quite nastily, but just between the two of us. And we found that often the conversations would be very, very stimulating. And we found that there was always a certain playfulness and humor that came through. And basically, I think it was last year I noticed actually that I'd stopped listening to a number of podcast series that I had been following. One of them was actually the Buddhist Geeks. And I found that when I thought about it, I thought, I don't listen anymore. The subject matter had become slightly too sort of technology focused and science focused for me. I know you're into your sciences, Ted. I tend to be more interested in the humanities. And I realized that I just wasn't the slightest bit interested, which wasn't a criticism. It just wasn't doing it for me. And I realized that there was a bit of a gap in the market. And I tried listening again, actually, to a number of podcast series, for example, with Upaya, where they had visiting academics who I think do some very interesting retreats and talks. For example, John Dunn, he's done some interesting talks on Tibetan Buddhism and the work of Shantideva and others. But again, I found them a little bit too enamored with Buddhism and there being a little bit too much reverence, I think. And sometimes the criticism would start, and I thought, he could go somewhere a little bit more interesting than he would stop, because his audience was very much a Buddhist one. And I thought, well, why not? Why don't I do something? You know, I'm a doer. I've got time on my hands. I quite like speaking. You know, I have a certain need to perform, I guess. So I came up with this idea of doing a podcast, but I really like working with other people. I don't like doing everything by myself. And I thought, why not with Stuart? Let's take those conversations. Let's see if we can manage to bring them into the public domain and actually say something worthwhile. And if not, let's try and have fun while doing it anyway. Again, thinking about success, we're not after followers. If one or two people really enjoy our discussion, I guess I'm kind of satisfied already. But really, it becomes a motivating force also for thinking more clearly about my ideas. And certainly I brought that towards the project. When I came up with the idea, as Stuart said earlier, I asked him if he'd be up for it because he's more technically savvy than I am. And he said yes. So that's how the podcast came about. It was inspired by 3 podcasts. The first one was the Buddhist Geeks, because Vince, as he said on several occasions, has always sought out the conversations that were important to him. And I think, you know, we're doing that as well. The second thing it was inspired by was a podcast that you may or may not know. Is called the Partially Examined Life. Do you know that one? Yeah, that's a philosophy podcast. I like the approach they took because they're not professional philosophers. They've trained in philosophy. So they have a lot of background experience, just as Stuart and I do. But they turn it into a conversation, and they actually put the effort in. So even though sometimes Stuart and I will definitely come across as being quite ignorant, and that's fine, we do a bit of research. We do try and prepare. We do try and say something at least semi-intelligent. And that's what they do too. It's quite playful as well in their interactions. The third podcast was actually the Joe Rogan podcast, which I also enjoy. And again, very playful, whole range of topics. You know, interviews are not just interviews, they're conversations. So that's kind of where it all comes from, Ted.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. And for those who aren't yet familiar, maybe, Stuart, you can give a little background on what's the format of the podcast?
How do you mean by what's the format of the podcast?
Well, so some podcasts are going to be an exploration of the suttas, and it'll be one person just reciting the sutta and talking about it. Mm-hmm. Others are going to be, like this one, primarily an interview-based format. Yours is it's a little bit different than that. You're doing something that's primarily the two of you, but you occasionally have guests. And I just want you to talk a little bit about that for those who haven't heard the podcast. What's it like?
It's good.
Well done.
And there you have it.
You should listen.
You should listen.
I like to challenge myself. What Matthew just said of liking to work with others, I love that. You know, if a project isn't meaningful to me, then I have a great deal of difficulty engaging with it and working with it, and that's really been the case through most of my life. If it's not meaningful, why bother? But you know, there's areas around that. There are grey areas around that, but primarily that's a driver for me. And finding out how I like to play around with things. I like to see how things work, how stuff goes together. And so it was a challenge to, can I use my audio skills to work on this? So that was a challenge that I wanted to answer. And you know, will I be able to publish this? Can we publish this? Is it possible to put material out there that's both meaningful, engaging, and challenging to the audience? That was one point. And the technical stuff's mostly taken care of. There may be some stuff that we need to do in the future with regards to going onto iTunes and that kind of stuff. So that'll be a technical challenge. But mostly now, the challenges with thinking and the challenges with the collaboration. You know, me and Matthew, we've known each other for years, and we have a good working relationship. You know, we know how the other thinks, and sometimes there might be a little bit of bashing of heads, but for the most part, we get to where we want to get going to, and we work well together. And so far, we've been putting out some, even if I do so it myself, we've been putting out some good content. I find it enjoyable. I find it engaging. And if other people find it useful and informative, you know, regardless of where they're at in their practice, then that's a positive side effect.
Yeah, the thing that I like about it is it's fun. You're listening into a conversation with two guys who they care about the practice. They want to ask some questions that might be a little tough that you can't otherwise ask when you're in a traditional setting. And that leads to some really interesting ideas being offered to the audience. And I actually want to talk about one of the episodes you had on Buddhist cults, and I'm wondering if maybe Matthew, you can kick us off on just saying a little bit about that one and what that was like.
Okay. Well, you asked a question about the format before. So the general idea is this, that we work in split episodes. Each is self-contained, but it was going to be based around a theme. So if you look at the titles, they're all theme-based. I think as it develops, we'll probably be quite consistent in having an initial discussion, which will always be between Stuart and I, and perhaps with a third member in the future. And then that's followed up with an interview with somebody, hopefully, who's a bit more knowledgeable than we are. As you mentioned, we like to try and talk about things that are not necessarily being discussed out in the open. So that's fundamental. I think, as we've sort of noted or sort of pointed out during our discussion so far, we're kind of free. We enjoy a certain degree of freedom, and we try to bring that to each episode. And we try to learn something ourselves and then provide something that might be of use to a general, relatively well-educated, intelligent, and curious audience. The episode that you mentioned on Buddhist cults, well, that comes from personal experience. So I spent quite a long time in the NKT, which is considered a Buddhist cult by many ex-followers. The experts in the field debate, the relevance and meaning of the term cult. Actually, in Italy, for example, it doesn't have a pejorative meaning at all. It's quite neutral. It's actually used by the Catholic Church. But we basically decided to put that name out there, to be a bit risque, to try and push the edge a little bit and try and make a statement about the sort of approach we were going to take, which is no holds barred, which is the tagline of the podcast too. So for that episode, what we tried to do was speak to experts. So I had quite a long conversation with an academic who works in the religious studies department in one of the universities. I won't mention where in England. She works for a charity called Inform, which basically provides information to followers, ex-followers, the government, and journalists on cults that are active in the UK. And we try to integrate that information into our general critique of I would say the extreme of the dysfunctional behavior of Tibetan Buddhism, but also other forms of Buddhism, and how it can lead to unthinking, often quite painful and destructive and mutually destructive forms of practice in the name of Buddhism. So, Stuart went off and studied one area, I went off and studied another, but primarily what we try and do with these episodes, Ted, and I think this is what allows Stuart and I to actually interact quite nicely and hopefully produce something that would be relevant to helping, a practitioner actually apply some of the ideas and concepts, is we try and bring forward the limits of our own present knowledge. We try to bring the listener into that. And I think what you said before was, very nice of you to say, and that seems to imply that it works to some degree. But we're willing to challenge. And I think the cult episode was probably one of our most challenging episodes. We had a lot of responses, especially on the SoundCloud page. And it was fascinating to see how people reacted. A hell of a lot of very, very positive feedback, which I actually didn't expect. I expected the negative. And we got that too. We got quite a few disgruntled members of some of the groups we mentioned, basically trying to justify their position. And what was interesting was they fell into one of the primary fallacies of critical thinking, or the absence of. They were unable to actually reflect critically on their own practice. So it was just justification. You're wrong. We've got the knowledge. You haven't. And you can't do that. And I
say so.
Yeah, that's right. And I think if we had a second tagline, it would be, we can do that. Actually, we can.
Yes, we can.
And we probably will.
We probably will. So, future episodes, we brainstorm on this occasionally, but certainly we're going to be looking at critical Buddhism. We're going to be looking at the role of even sex in Buddhism. We're happy to talk about that. That's a very untouched subject. And that's going to be an interesting one because I don't want to end up talking about, naughty guru figures and sexual abuse. That's not my interest. But there's lots to talk about. Basically, all of the stuff that possibly Buddhist institutions and, let's say, more savory Buddhist podcasts, well, they won't do, we're happy to do. And we try to do it respectfully. We try to do it creatively. And we'll just see where it takes us, I guess.
Excellent. Stuart, how about you? What have been your experiences in putting the podcast together and just in participating in it? What's that been like for you?
Thanks for asking. It's been an interesting, I'll use the word again. It's been an interesting challenge, and I'm sure that you've seen the same thing yourself with regards to building an ongoing, essentially open source form of medium, because people can access it on the internet and it's free. And it's good. It's a positive experience, because going on to the episode with the cults, it was really interesting to dig into areas of Buddhism and areas of practice and its implications and immediate implications for the people involved, for the the individuals involved. It was interesting to see the implications of that. It was interesting to see the reflective implications for what it means for my practice and groups I've been involved with. And it's also extremely interesting to see what the implications would be now and in the future, and what that would mean, and changes that needed to be addressed. For example, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying was a book that I grew up reading, and it was one of the first Buddhist books that I read. And then, because the material's widely available now, it was not only shocking, but I was kind of appalled to read that maybe that book wasn't written by Sogyal Rinpoche. And I'm not out to bash the guy at all in any way, shape, or form, but there's certainly controversy around that, and controversy that hasn't been addressed or appropriately defended. And without getting on too hot a topic, there are other areas involved with that are on the podcast that might not necessarily need to be aired now, but were very interesting for me to look at. And they were interesting because they're not discussed. These areas aren't discussed. They're not open. And the groups about them, the groups that these happen in, they're not open about them. And other groups aren't open enough to other groups to have the discussion either. Seems that way, maybe not, right? But
I think you're right. There's a lack of transparency in, hey, what's going on here?
Yeah, that's right. So that was, for me, Ted, that was very interesting to look at that. And that seems to be, each podcast in its own way has a flavor of that. And so in participating with this, that's definitely a positive, that my practice is growing because of this,
Yep. Give the same thing, that this is just doing this podcast has been wonderful for my own practice and the things that I learn that otherwise I wouldn't challenge myself to explore before bringing on a guest to talk about something. And that's been wonderful in my own experience with this. It sounds like it has been for you too.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, what does practice mean? But in that respect, yeah.
So guys, before we bring things to a close, I want to ask each of you in turn, what else would you like to share with the listeners? Matthew, what's on your mind that you might want to speak to?
Well, I would invite people to come and have a look at our Facebook page and Twitter feed. And I would invite anybody who feels passionately about the deconstruction and reconstruction of Buddhism that we've been talking about and would like to get stuck in to come and participate. We're open to having non-experts on the show. We're happy to have them. That's part of our desire, really, actually, is to bring on guests who perhaps are doing interesting work in the background or quietly just getting on with it, and who we consider valuable enough or important enough to actually be brought to a wider audience. And I'd also love actually, to, like I said, hinted at before, to have third members on, people coming in like us who are working with ideas and working with their implications and applications. Come on and join in the fun. I mean, it's a creative process, and if somebody's got a bit of a sense of humor, they can certainly participate. And that would be what I'd like to add. I mean, I think we've talked about the most important stuff that I'm doing. The website, people can go and have a look at if they like. But the podcast is only going to grow. It's only going to expand, and it will continue to have some of the flavors that Stuart was discussing and we've talked about before. And I think that's probably all I need to add.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. And Stuart, how about you? Is there anything that you'd like to share with the listeners before we draw to a close?
Just to enjoy what you're doing and explore with where your practice is, and to challenge the boundaries of that. And that's certainly a flavor of the podcast. For people that have listened, thank you for listening. For people that would like to listen, jump over to the SoundCloud page and have a listen, because it's good stuff, and it's expanding. I sent a few links out to old friends and people that are involved with the Shambhala group, and they really enjoyed it. It made them reflect on their practice, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for being able to have the ability to be able to do this. So that's cool, Ted. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Stuart. So for folks who are listening to this podcast, I will be linking to Post-Traditional Buddhism website as well as the Imperfect Buddha podcast, and that will also include their Facebook page. Be sure you take a look at that, and their SoundCloud page as well. Our guest today, Matthew O'Connell. Matthew, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Ted, for an interesting discussion.
And Stuart Baldwin. Stuart, thank you for being here.
Cheers, Ted. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.